At 62, I thought the mountains held nothing but peace for me. Instead, one phone call shattered that illusion forever. Before I tell you what happened, write your country name in the comments. I love seeing where my stories reach. Catherine, my stepfather's voice oozed through the receiver, far too cheerful for a Tuesday evening. Just thought you'd want to know. I sold the mountain cabin. The words hit me like ice water down my back. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles ached. You did what? I whispered, though part of me already knew I'd heard him right. I sold it, he repeated casually, like he was talking about an old lawnmower instead of the one place in this world that felt entirely mine. Then he chuckled. Don't look so shocked, Catherine. It's for the greater good. My good, obviously. My name is Catherine Daniels. I'm 62 years old, and for as long as I can remember, Richard, my stepfather, has been a thorn in my side. My mother married him when I was 15, dazzled by his charm and easy humour. But beneath his polished exterior was a man who always put himself first, no matter who it hurt. The cabin wasn't just a second home, it was my refuge. Nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, it was where I went to breathe after grueling work trips, where I hosted old friends on long weekends, where silence and birdsong became medicine for my soul. Hearing Richard toss it around like poker chips to cover his debts made my blood boil. You had no right, I snapped, though my voice trembled. That cabin wasn't yours to sell. Relax, he drawled. I've been managing things while you're off saving the world. Besides, what's the point of holding on to a place you're never around to enjoy? It was an easy way to clear my debts. You'll thank me later. I'll thank you when hell freezes over, I shot back, slamming the phone down before he could laugh a calm gain. I stood in the middle of my Denver apartment, pacing, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Richard's audacity knew no bounds, but this time he'd crossed a line he couldn't slither his way back over. Because what Richard didn't know was this: the cabin wasn't entirely mine to sell. My best friend of 40 years, Laura Langley, was co-owner. Years ago, when we restored the place together, we signed a co-ownership agreement that explicitly required both of our signatures for any sale to go through. He thought he'd outsmarted me. He thought wrong. I tapped Laura's name on my phone. Kathy, she answered, cheerful as ever. He sold the cabin, I blurted, unable to mask the fury in my voice. A beat of silence, then. He what? Apparently he needed the money to pay off his gambling debts, but our agreement makes that impossible. He doesn't have the authority. Laura whistled low. That man has no shame. None. But you're right. We'll handle this. I'll pull up the papers right now. The weight in my chest loosened just slightly. Thank you, Laura. I'll wrap up my work assignment and be home in 3 days. We'll deal with him then. As I hung up, a strange calm crept in. Richard thought I was still the timid girl he'd steamrolled years ago, the one who avoided conflict just to keep peace in the house. But I'm not that girl anymore. I'm a woman who's built a career, made allies, and knows exactly how to use the law to her advantage. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my journal, the same journal I'd carried on every trip for decades. Writing had always been my way of sorting chaos into order, and I needed clarity now more than ever. So I wrote, first time at the cabin, Mum and I chasing fireflies until dusk, teenage summers, long hikes, blueberry pies cooling on the porch. After Mum passed, the cabin as my anchor when everything else crumbled. With Laura, the weekends we painted walls, repaired leaks, laughed until midnight by the fire. Every word I wrote reminded me this wasn't just real estate, it was my lifeline, my sanctuary, a piece of myself. And Richard thought he could swap it for a handful of cash and another chance at the poker table. Not this time. The next day Laura called back, her tone brisk. I combed through our co-ownership agreement. You're absolutely right. The sale is invalid without my signature. Legally, Richard doesn't have a leg to stand on. Relief flooded me, but anger wasn't far behind. Do we know who he sold it to? Not yet, she said. County records show no transfer of ownership. My guess? He tried to do this under the table. That sounded exactly like Richard. cutting corners, sneaking behind backs, convinced he was cleverer than everyone else. "What's our next step?" I asked. "We can confront him, or we can let the legal process handle it," Laura said. "Either way, he's boxed in, and we're in the clear." I exhaled slowly, tension bleeding out of me. "Thank you, Laura, really, you've always had my back." "You'd figure it out without me," she replied, warm but firm. "But we'll do this together." Together. That word mattered more than she knew. Because as much as Richard had shaped my younger years with his bullying, it was Laura who'd taught me how to rebuild myself brick by brick. She'd stood by me when I buried my mother. She'd driven across state lines just to help fix a burst pipe one winter. She wasn't just my best friend. She was family, the kind that never let you down. And Richard, he was about to find out what it felt like when people finally stopped letting him walk all over them. By the time I boarded my flight home 2 days later, I had a plan forming in the back of my mind. Not anger, not shouting. That's what Richard expected. No, I'd use the one thing he'd always underestimated in me, my ability to think 3 steps ahead. The cabin wasn't gone, not legally, not emotionally, and by the time this was over, Richard would learn, finally and fully, that I was not a woman to be underestimated. The drive from the airport back to my Denver apartment felt longer than usual. My mind spun with possibilities. What kind of mess had Richard tangled himself in this time? And more importantly, how far would he go to drag me down with him? By the time I pulled into the garage, night had already settled over the city. My neighbor Diane was walking her golden retriever and waved when she saw me. "Back from another trip?" she asked. "Back to a storm, more like," I muttered. Inside, I tossed my suitcase aside and went straight to the old oak desk where I kept my legal files. I pulled out the manila folder marked Cabin Agreement, Langley Daniels. There it was, in black and white. Neither party shall sell, transfer, or encumber the property without the written consent and signature of both owners. I ran my fingers over the embossed notary seal, almost smiling. Richard could twist words, manipulate emotions, and charm his way out of parking tickets, but he couldn't charm his way past a notary public. Laura was right. Legally, we were untouchable. Still, a gnawing question remained. Who had Richard promised the cabin to, and what would they do when they discovered he didn't have the authority? 2 days later, my phone rang while I was brewing coffee. Unknown number. "Hello? Is this Catherine Daniels?" a deep voice asked. "Yes, who's speaking?" "This is Daniel Mercer. I believe you and I need to talk about the cabin." I froze, the mug slipping slightly in my grip. "Excuse me, I bought it," he said, "from Richard." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Well, Mr. Mercer, you didn't buy anything. Richard doesn't own the cabin. He never has. It belongs to me and Laura Langley, and without both our signatures, no sale is valid." Silence stretched for several beats. Then he sighed. I suspected as much, but Richard was persuasive. He said the papers were just a formality. I shook my head, anger bubbling. Persuasive is one word for him. Fraudulent is another. "I don't want trouble, Miss Daniels," Mercer said carefully, "but I've already transferred money, a lot of money." I closed my eyes. That figured. Richard wouldn't just cheat. He'd con someone who had resources, which meant this was about to spiral into something much uglier. That evening, Laura came over, carrying a bottle of wine and her ever-present briefcase. She spread papers across my dining table. "County records still show us as the only owners," she said. "Mercer never filed a deed transfer. Legally, nothing's changed." "But Richard took his money," I muttered, pacing. "So now Mercer thinks he's been swindled, which of course he has." Laura leaned back, sipping her wine. "So let him take it up with Richard. Not our circus, not our monkeys." I wanted to believe her, but something about Mercer's voice lingered with me. Calm, controlled, the kind of man who didn't back down easily. "What if he decides the easiest solution is to come after us?" I asked. "Then he'll lose," she said simply. "We have the papers. End of story." But deep down, I knew it wasn't the end, not with Richard still scheming. Sure enough, 2 days later, Richard himself showed up at my doorstep. I opened the door to find him leaning on the frame like he owned the place, wearing his usual smug grin. His once perfect hair was thinner now, his suit wrinkled, but the arrogance, that hadn't aged a day. "Kathy," he said, drawing out the syllables, "we need to talk." "No, Richard," I replied, keeping my voice cold. "You need to explain." He chuckled, stepping inside uninvited. "Always so dramatic. Look, Mercer was getting nervous. I told him you'd come around, that you'd see the logic in letting the cabin go. He's offering top dollar, enough to set us both up comfortably." I crossed my arms. "You mean enough to cover your debts and maybe buy you a new set of poker chips? Don't drag me into your mess." His grin faltered for the first time. "Careful, Catherine. You don't want to make an enemy of Mercer. He's not the kind of man you cross." I stared at him, realization dawning. "You're afraid of him?" Richard's eyes flickered just for a moment, and I knew I was right. He hadn't just conned an ordinary buyer, he'd conned someone dangerous. After he left, Laura called. "He showed up at my house too," she said. "Same pitch, same veiled threats." "We can't let him bully us," I said. "Agreed, but we also can't underestimate Mercer. If Richard owes him money, we're collateral damage." That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the apartment made me jolt. The thought of some stranger believing he owned my sanctuary, my mother's legacy, gnawed at me. By morning, I made a decision. "We fight back," I told Laura over coffee. "Not just with paperwork. We confront both of them, together." Her brow arched. "Face Mercer and Richard head on." "Yes," I said firmly. "It's time Richard learns I'm not the girl he can bully anymore. And Mercer, he needs to see the truth straight from us." Laura studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, let's end this." The following week, we arranged a meeting at a neutral spot, a law office downtown. Mercer agreed, surprisingly quickly. When I walked into that polished conference room, the tension was thick enough to cut. Mercer sat at the table, broad-shouldered, his expensive suit crisp, his gaze sharp. Richard lounged beside him, smirking like a man who thought he still held all the cards. I sat across from them, Laura at my side, and slid a thick folder across the table. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is the co-ownership agreement. Signed, sealed, notarized. Richard had no authority to sell the cabin, which means, Mr. Mercer, you don't own it, and you never will, at least not from him." Mercer flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. Richard shifted uncomfortably, the smirk slipping. Finally, Mercer closed the folder and looked at me. "You're a sharp woman, Miss Daniels, smarter than Richard gave you credit for." "Most women are," I replied coolly. Mercer leaned back, steepling his fingers. "So here's the real question. What happens next? Because I don't intend to walk away empty-handed." And just like that, the real battle began. The conference room air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to catch every word. Laura's calm presence beside me steadied my hands, but my heart drummed like a war drum in my chest. Mercer's gaze lingered on me, sharp and calculating. Richard fidgeted with his cufflinks, his old charm noticeably cracking. For the first time I realized he wasn't steering this meeting, Mercer was. "You see my position," Mercer said smoothly, tapping the folder with one manicured finger. "I've already wired $500,000 in dollars. That doesn't just disappear." I leaned forward. "Then you take it up with Richard. He lied to you. He pocketed your money. The cabin isn't for sale, and it never was." Mercer smiled, a thin, unsettling curve. "And you think I'll let Richard walk away after cheating me?" Richard coughed nervously. "Now, Dan, let's not escalate things." Mercer turned his gaze on him, sharp as a blade. "You told me this was clean. You told me you controlled the property." "And I do," Richard began, but I cut him off. "No, he doesn't." I shoved the notarized pages across the table again. "My mother bought that land. She willed it to me. Laura and I put the co-ownership agreement in place years ago. Richard has no claim, no rights, and certainly no authority to sell it." Mercer's eyes flicked over the papers again, though I knew he'd already absorbed every line. He wasn't the kind of man who overlooked details. He was the kind who looked for pressure points. "Interesting," he said finally. "So if this is true, Richard committed fraud, which leaves me with two choices: take him to court or handle matters another way." The way he said it made my blood run cold. Laura cleared her throat, her lawyer's composure unwavering. "If you're considering anything outside the law, Mr. Mercer, I'd advise against it. Catherine and I are fully prepared to involve the police. We already have documentation of Richard's attempted fraud." Mercer chuckled softly. "You're a sharp one too, Ms. Langley, but let's be realistic. Court cases drag on for years. Police reports get buried. And in the meantime, Catherine, you'll be spending your weekends in that mountain cabin, wondering when the other shoe will drop." His words slithered into the air, not a threat, but not a reassurance either. I swallowed hard, then steadied my voice. "You may intimidate Richard, but I'm not him. That cabin is my sanctuary, my mother's legacy. If you so much as step foot on that land, I'll have the sheriff on speed dial. Don't test me." For the first time, Mercer's smile faltered, just slightly, enough to tell me I'd surprised him. Richard, desperate to regain control, jumped in. "All right, enough of this. Let's just agree on a new deal. Kathy, you sign the papers, Mercer gets the cabin, and we all walk away with something." I turned to him, fury boiling. "Do you even hear yourself? You tried to sell my life's refuge behind my back, and now you expect me to reward you? No, Richard, that cabin isn't yours to bargain with." His face reddened, his voice rising. "I built that place with your mother. I spent years maintaining it while you were off living your life." I slammed my hand on the table. "You built nothing. My mother's money paid for every plank, every nail. You saw her as your bank account then, and now you're trying to use me the same way. Not anymore." Laura laid a hand on my arm, grounding me. Mercer's eyes darted between us, calculating again. "Seems you two are immovable. That's inconvenient." He stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. "Richard, we'll talk later. Catherine, Miss Langley, I'll be in touch." He left the room without looking back, his footsteps echoing like a countdown. The silence afterward was deafening. Richard sagged in his chair, wiping sweat from his brow. "You shouldn't have antagonized him. You don't know what he's capable of." I stared at him, incredulous. "What he's capable of? You're the one who brought him into this. You're the one who lied, who forged, who stole. Don't you dare act like I'm the problem." His shoulders slumped, and for once he had no comeback. Laura gathered the papers and stuffed them into her briefcase. "We need to file an official fraud complaint today, before Mercer decides on his other way." That night I couldn't shake Mercer's words. Every creak in my apartment reminded me of him. Every shadow on the street felt heavier. I sat at the window, staring at the Denver skyline, remembering the nights I spent in the cabin, the stars spread above me like an endless quilt. That cabin wasn't just wood and stone. It was peace. It was safety. It was my last tether to my mother. And I would not lose it, not to Richard's greed, not to Mercer's intimidation. By morning, Laura and I were at the county sheriff's office, filing the complaint. Detective Miller, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, listened carefully as we laid out the documents, the attempted sale, the forged promises. "You did the right thing coming here," she said, scribbling notes. "If Mercer presses, we'll intervene. And Richard," she glanced at the report, "he'll be facing fraud charges. Don't let him scare you into silence." That evening, Richard called. His voice was shaky, the bravado gone. "Kathy, please, don't press charges. Mercer's not going to let this go, and if I go down, he'll come after you next. We need to be on the same side." The audacity made me laugh bitterly. "On the same side? You betrayed me, Richard. You betrayed Mom's memory. Whatever happens now, you brought it on yourself." I hung up, my hands trembling, but not with fear, with resolve. The confrontation had changed everything. Mercer knew I wouldn't fold. Richard knew his lies had finally caught up to him. But something in my gut told me the storm wasn't over. Mercer wasn't a man who walked away quietly. and if he was coming back, I needed to be ready. The sheriff's office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the kind of place where people came searching for justice and sometimes found only bureaucracy. But Detective Miller struck me as different. Her eyes were steady, her posture solid, the kind of woman who had seen plenty of men like Richard, and plenty of men like Mercer too. "We'll process your fraud complaint," she told Laura and me, "and we'll put a hold on any false filings Mercer or Richard might attempt. In the meantime, keep your documentation close. Don't engage with them directly unless we're present." I nodded, but my stomach churned. Documentation could protect me in court, but paper alone didn't stop a man like Mercer. He had the resources, the confidence, and worst of all, the patience. And sure enough, 3 nights later, I found a white envelope tucked under my apartment door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no signature, just 6 words, typed neatly in the middle. "Everyone has a price, Ms. Daniels." I sat at my kitchen table staring at it, the refrigerator humming behind me, the city lights flickering through the blinds. My fingers trembled as I set the paper down. Mercer wasn't bluffing. He was reminding me that in his world, money solved everything, and if money didn't, pressure did. The next morning, Laura came over. She read the note, jaw tightening. "This is intimidation, pure and simple. I'll take it straight to Miller." But I shook my head. "No, that's what he wants, to rattle me, to make me run. If I let him scare me out of the cabin, he wins without lifting a finger." Laura looked at me for a long time. "So what's your move?" "My move," I said slowly, "is to remind him this cabin isn't just a piece of property. It's blood, it's history. And if he wants to play a long game, I'll show him just how stubborn a Daniel's womb and can be." That weekend, I drove up to the cabin. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, the pine trees swayed gently overhead, and the air smelled of resin and mountain earth. My chest loosened the moment I stepped onto the porch. Inside, I lit a fire, pulled a quilt over my shoulders, and sat in my mother's old rocking chair. I could almost hear her voice, steady and warm, telling me not to let Richard's greed erase what she'd built for me. I knew then. Mercer could threaten, Richard could connive, but neither of them would take this place, not while I was still breathing. 3 days later, Mercer's lawyer filed a civil claim against me and Laura, alleging we had interfered with his property rights. It was laughable on its face, but I felt the chill anyway. Mercer wasn't giving up, he was escalating. Laura handled the response with surgical precision, filing counterclaims and attaching every notarized document we had. Detective Miller added her fraud investigation file to the record. Piece by piece, Mercer's case unraveled. But the pressure mounted. Strange cars idled near my apartment. Unfamiliar numbers called at odd hours. Once I swore I saw a man watching me from across the grocery store parking lot. Fear gnawed at me, but so did resolve. I would not be driven out of my own life. The breakthrough came 2 months later. Detective Miller called, her voice brisk. "We've obtained bank records. Richard withdrew Mercer's money through a series of wire transfers to cover gambling debts in Las Vegas. We've also confirmed he forged your signature on a draft deed he tried to file, but the county clerk flagged it." I let out a shaky laugh. "So the house of cards is falling?" "Exactly," Miller said. "Richard's looking at charges. Mercer may pursue him for restitution, but you and Miss Langley are clear." The trial was messy. Richard sat slumped at the defense table, no longer smug, just worn down. Mercer appeared twice, towering in his tailored suit, glaring at both of us as if we were obstacles instead of people. But the documents spoke louder than his money. The judge dismissed Mercer's claims entirely and referred Richard's fraud to the district attorney. When the gavel struck for the final time, I felt a weight lift that had been pressing on me for years, long before Mercer, long before the fake sale. It was the weight of Richard's shadow, finally pushed off my shoulders. A month later, I drove back to the cabin. Snow dusted the roof, the pines shimmered with frost, and the air was so crisp it stung my lungs. Inside, I stoked the fire and brewed a pot of tea. Laura joined me that evening, her laughter filling the space as we sat across from each other. "To your mother," she toasted, raising her mug. "To freedom," I added, clinking mine against hers. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the crackle of the fire. Outside, the stars glittered, indifferent and eternal. This cabin had survived storms, betrayals, and even attempted theft, and now, finally, it belonged fully to me again, not just legally, but spiritually. Richard faded from my life after the trial, swallowed by his debts and disgrace. Mercer too disappeared, no doubt cutting his losses and turning his sharp eyes to some new target. As for me, I found something I hadn't felt in years, peace, not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the sturdy peace of a woman who had fought for her ground and won. The cabin wasn't just a building anymore, it was proof that I could stand up to bullies, manipulators, and men who thought women like me would fold under pressure. I didn't fold. I reclaimed. And in that quiet mountain air, with the fire warming my skin and my mother's quilt wrapped around me, I knew this was my quiet revenge. Not loud, not flashy, just steady, unshakable, and mine,